Have you noticed that entertainment kind of sucks lately? I mean, it's not like there's absolutely nothing to go out there and see, but when these massive titles with huge fan bases start to perform poorly, that's a sign that there's something seriously wrong going on in the industry. There's no reason for a Lord of the Rings series to fail. There's no reason for Star Wars to put movie production on halt and resort to putting out shitty Disney Plus series. There's no reason that Marvel and DC should be losing their audience to competition. It can be kind of hard to tell when it comes to Marvel and DC, but you can look at the cancellations and you can look at the market share as compared to foreign competitors, and you can start to realize that there is definitely something wrong there too. I think it's pretty clear by all those cases that there is something whack going on in the market right now. A Lord of the Rings series backed by a massive company and with a billion-dollar budget has basically no passion coming from its fandom. It has died pretty much overnight after it ended. There's no reason for Star Wars to have failed. It had a massive fan base, but now it's been reduced to a streaming property, and all it can do is put out shitty Disney Plus series. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny might as well already be dead. How do Marvel and DC get pushed out of the market? Marvel and DC, the two titans that pretty much defined the American graphic novel scene. How do they get pushed out of the market by foreign competition like manga? I'm a massive fan of Batman, Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings. Yet, anything that comes out with those titles anymore lacks any allure to me. And it made me wonder why that is. Why do things I used to love suck now? When you get down to it, the answer really isn't all that hard to figure out. It's the writers. The writers suck at their jobs. They lack any iota of creativity and constantly want to use whatever property they get their hands on as a platform to air their grievances with the rest of the world. They don't want to tell a good story anymore. They want to preach at you and lecture you about how awful you are. So they'll insert themselves into these stories just to elevate themselves, and they'll destroy all the characters their ideological enemies love. Hell, look what they did to the Punisher just because people they don't like rep his logo. Modern cartoons, television, comics, and movies are less and less about telling good stories that people actually want to hear, and more about the people working on them using it as a way to get validation out of other people via self-insert characters. Their initial goal is no longer making something great, it's about elevating themselves. The most important thing in all of this is them, their identity, and their trauma. And that kind of writing makes everything very shallow and very unappealing. Bad writers, enabled by shitty corporations that don't give a flip about the fandoms they paid for, are a cancer that is killing the entertainment industry. These people are all about virtue signaling, being the first this or that, or representation and all of that. And it's no longer about telling the next act of the story, because all they want to do is point out how evil the fans are and how morally superior they, as the good people, are to the people who originally watched this thing. So instead of daring people who are shooting for the stars and aiming for greatness, you have these self-aggrandizing idiots who couldn't come up with a new and creative idea if their life depended on it. They're arrogant and narcissistic people. And that much you can tell by the very projects that they produce, the arguments that they make to justify the bastardizations they put in, and the way they treat their fans when these projects inevitably fail. They're people who are so creatively bankrupt, the only thing they can do is take an existing story and just change the skin tone, sexuality, or genitals of any given character. Because, as they'll say, we need to see ourselves, or it's interpreted for a modern audience. You can't even really call it a reimagining, because they literally will just take the original story and then change it up a hair to fit their ideology. We need to see ourselves in fiction. God, I hate hearing that. You know, that statement actually says quite a bit more than you would think about the person saying it. On the surface, you can tell that their identity is largely, if not entirely, generated from being a member of one of many checkbox marginalized groups in society. It's one of those things that usually comes from people who see themselves as their label and not as an individual. And that's a very sad and limiting way to see yourself. But then you start to peel back the layers and you start to realize just how narcissistic it really is, because it basically suggests that you cannot empathize with other people because their story doesn't matter to you. Only your story is important to you. It's this weird idea that suggests that you can't possibly see anything praiseworthy or admirable in someone who doesn't look like you, bang the same people as you, or have the same genitals as you. If a character has to be just like you for you to even care, then yes, it absolutely is a declaration of narcissism. It's basically a declaration that in the grand scheme of things, only you matter, and you only care if it's about your story. We need to see ourselves can basically be reworded as, if it's not about us, we don't care. Here's a little history for you, and it's something that I've always found fascinating. The idea of narcissism stems from a Roman poet who wrote a tale about a man who was so self-centered the gods cursed him with an infatuation with himself, and he fell in love with his reflection. If he couldn't see himself, he didn't care. You see, one of the important things about the human condition is being able to empathize with people who aren't like you and have been through things that you haven't. And once you throw out your ability to empathize with people who aren't you and have been through things you haven't been through, you fundamentally lose the ability to enjoy any amount of good fiction. Another part of great fiction is being able to aspire to something that you aren't currently. That's why superheroes were so fantastic. That's why the ideas of Batman, Superman, and whatever Marvel characters you like, because I was a DC fanboy for the longest time. That's why those things were so important to people, because they saw things in those characters. Heroism, confidence, strength, things that people actually aspired to be. That's what seeing yourself in fiction should be, but it's not anymore. Instead of looking to these characters and finding in them admirable qualities we want to see in ourselves, these people have started replacing that with the idea that you should only really want to see whatever checkbox you are up there. In essence, the content of your character doesn't matter to these people. If you don't look like them, if you aren't them, they don't give a flip. And that's why you see so many of these race and gender swapped characters fail. Because they're shallow, empty shells of former characters who were far superior. And the writers aren't doing it because they think it actually makes the character better. They're doing it to validate themselves. They finally get to play the hero, and they get to use this as a soapbox to air their grievances with the world because they think their champagne problems are actually a struggle. And then all of this gets pumped full of cringe dialogue, stuff like I'm a trans woman in Gotham or whatever, because it's no longer about the content of the character's character, it's about what check marks that character ticks off. And when the character's identity ends up being more important, so important in fact that you have to constantly remind people about it, you kill the character. Because they basically become an arrogant, annoying, shallow person in the story. And nobody really wants to deal with that kind of person. Tales of Old didn't succeed because of what checkboxes they marked off. They succeeded because their characters could inspire something in people. They succeeded because they told tales of heroism, about people who had struggles and overcame, and did things that inspired the readers or enchanted them with great tales. It isn't about looking like Superman. It's about being like Superman, a guy who inspires hope, who spends his time using his powers for justice and for good. These are the intangible qualities we should be trying to see ourselves in. But the writers can't figure that out, because the only thing that matters to them is their own identity and themselves. And when your identity becomes more important than the content of your character, you become a shallow, empty person that nobody wants to be around and who can't understand why everyone rejects you. These characters are written to be what they are, and they are rejected because of who they are. And when your story is more about what you are than who you are, it will not resonate with people. Not nearly as much is a story built on something applicable to a vast amount of people, regardless of physical characteristics. And now, the Hollywood hackery doesn't end there, because you have the interpreted for a modern audience line. I mean, there's a bit to unpack here too, but mostly it just makes me laugh, because more often than not, it's just fucking hubris.
Thing was actually bad because reason, therefore I, the savior of all fiction, must come and fix it.
But more often than not, things they are trying to quote-unquote fix were never actually flaws to begin with. It's almost always about the way people look. It's never like, well, this character didn't fit in well with the plot, so we'll just adjust the story a bit more to make them more relevant. Or, this character's actions didn't actually align with their original motive, so maybe we should adjust their motives to fit their actions and keep the plot intact. It's never actually anything constructive towards making a better thing. It's always just too many white straight guys. This obsession with second-hand representation is more than anything what proves how creatively bankrupt these people actually are. Rather than try to come up with something new and market it as a brand new idea full of diverse characters and all of that, they instead decide to opt for taking someone else's work and changing the color. It would basically be the equivalent of me going and screen capping someone else's video and then just editing in my face over them. There's nothing new being added. I'm just changing the way it looks a bit. They don't have the ideas or talent to make a brand new idea appeal to a massive amount of people. So instead, they go and buy something that already has a massive fandom and just try to insert whatever ideas they want into the existing story. Honestly, I find it kind of amazing that these creatively bankrupt people are so full of themselves. They think they can improve upon the works of a guy who made 4 novels that were interpreted into 38 different languages, which he wrote his own language for, and define some very important fantasy tropes. They go out of their way to find these phantasmal evils of racism, bigotry, and sexism in these things, but then all they end up creating are whiny, annoying characters, all for the sake of their identity politics. These new, corrected versions of things end up lacking the charm, charisma, and appeal of the original. They fail to capture what people actually liked and just end up being nothing more than an identity politics sermon. Okay, how about the strong female character mantra that gets thrown around all the time? It rejects classical, strong female characters that were decisive and appealing to people, the likes of Sarah Connor or Princess Leia or the real Galadriel. Oftentimes, in order to prove how valid this female character is, she doesn't struggle with anything, and in fact is able to beat a lot of her male counterparts at just about everything because she's naturally better. But it's not like it's done in a clever way. It's always done through brute force. So basically, a woman just has to be a man. But this overconfident, whiny, lack of a struggle character arc is how you end up with stuff like Rings of Power Galadriel and Brie Larson's Captain Marvel. They lack so much creativity that they don't see the value that femininity can bring to a story. All they're capable of seeing is that brute force and disagreeableness can bludgeon your way through any problem. And because they lack any sort of creativity, they can't come up with any other way for a female character to possibly get the upper hand over a male character. They can't do anything clever, they can't do anything cunning, it's all brute strength. So instead of creating a truly witty and cunning female character who's able to manipulate people into doing what she wants them to do, they basically just make every dude a himbo who's still weaker than the female character. Basically, they're so bad at writing, they have to make other characters worse to make a character look better. The summary of all that is basically that modern creative writers are so lacking in creativity that they can't actually make anything new. And since characters are only as creative or smart as the people writing them, the characters you see tend to suck as well, just as much as the writers. And of course, the moment you have a problem with the bastardized versions of your favorite stories, the moment you point out just how bad all of this actually is it's your fault. They're so good at their jobs, they can't possibly have failed. Therefore, the blame must lie somewhere else. They can't possibly have made a mistake and produced something people don't like, so the answer must just be that you're a bigot. It's not their fault they're so creatively bankrupt they give cancer to whatever property they touch and destroy it and make it something you don't like, so you tell them that you don't like it. It's your fault for not liking it, obviously. Fans and people with more than 2 brain cells get blamed for rejecting things that suck. And when things fail hard, the likes of She-Hulk and Rings of Power, the media goes into full defense mode with articles about toxic fandom or review bombing or why fandom is actually attacking this because of racism. This loops back around to them basing their identity on what they are rather than who they are. Because when you criticize the thing they've made, you're attacking their identity and therefore you must be an evil person. They can't detach your criticism of their shitty work from themselves. So therefore, you must just hate them. Because if you didn't hate them, you would never hate this project that they made. That basically validates their entire identity. I think the first instance of fan blaming I went through was with The Last Jedi. I was in denial leaving that movie. I loved Star Wars. I wanted to like that movie. I wanted to convince myself that it was good. But it just wasn't sitting right with me. And after stewing on it, I realized I just straight up hated the movie. I loathed it. It was awful. But of course, Rian Johnson couldn't accept that he had actually done something wrong. So when a lot of fans complained about how bad the movie actually was, it wasn't because he had made a bad movie. It was because they couldn't stomach a strong female lead, as if Princess Leia had never been in the series before. Look, it's natural for anything, no matter how good, to get some pushback from fans when things aren't entirely accurate. That's just the nature of adapting something from a book or a comic or a video game to a screen. And yeah, some of it can be really nitpicky and harsh and sometimes even unjustified. But that's the point where you should look at that and see ways to improve and try to mitigate that. You're never going to please 100% of the people 100% of the time. It's impossible. It doesn't work. But when you're so full of yourself that you can't take at least a little bit of that blame onto yourself and improve, and instead you have to offload that on all the people who were looking to you to adapt something they loved, you're going to get yourself into a hot mess. It doesn't help that these people largely see you as low-life bigots who are just there to feed them money because they're so great. They already have it in their heads that they can't possibly fail, that they're the center of the universe, that everything is about them, or it at least has to be about them. And since you're already the enemy, once you start talking about something they did wrong, they're just going to deflect. They can't possibly see criticism and improve. They can't possibly see a flaw in themselves. They're perfect, and they'll never improve. And again, the only remaining option is that it's the fans who are actually evil. They're awful people who need to be lectured more and brought into submission.
Don't you dare criticize me. I'm perfect. It's you who is the problem. You can't see how amazing my work is. You just don't understand, you peon. I've saved this story. I've saved lives with my work. Can't you see how important it really is to the world?
I think one of the greatest things on top of all of this is that these awful writers are now on strike, thinking they deserve more work and more money for it. Meanwhile, there's less and less money coming in. People are less and less interested in this trash. Manga, anime, independent stuff is booting all of this stuff out of the way and taking center stage. These people won't learn until these zombie IPs are dead and gone. And even then, I still don't think they'll entirely learn their lesson. I think these zombie titles are going to continue to shamble around for a little while yet. They have yet to learn that people have largely rejected the things that they've been injecting into this. They're going to refuse to see it right up until the money dries up and there's no one spending anything on these things anymore. The sad truth is they don't actually love the titles they're working with. They just see them as a cash cow in the corporation's position, and as a platform to preach to people in the writer's position. They hate you, the stories you love, and the characters you looked up to. Fiction used to be dominated by people who loved what they were doing, who loved the stories they were writing, the characters they were working with, the things they were trying to put out there for people to enjoy. That's what made all of the great entertainment you probably grew up with. Unfortunately, to a lot of the writers who are working on these things now, it's not about creating things for the fans who made these things huge. It's about them and the attention they get from doing all this stuff. They create out of hubris, narcissism, and hatred. And that was never a good place to make anything from. And yeah, the more that these writers have touched the things I've loved, zombified them to hell and back, the less and less I've cared. I've resorted to going back to things that were made before I was born to enjoy the characters and the stories that I love. You see, back then, it was a desire for greatness that drove people to create successful things. Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Lord of the Rings. These people had a passion for what they were doing. They loved it. And that made them want to make it as perfect as they could. It drove them towards greatness. Ultimately, that's really the most noble endeavor you can have in creative work, is to strive for greatness. The reason a lot of modern entertainment seems to suck is because it lacks that desire for greatness. It is apathy on the writer's part, combined with their hatred for the fans, that has killed a lot of these things. It's a wasteland out there. Anything Disney might as well be dead. DC's failings are a whole other animal. The Witcher's not gonna last without Henry Cavill. Rings of Power, it's a laughingstock. So yeah, I'm voting with my dollar on this one. I'm taking my money and putting it into things that I'm actually going to get enjoyment out of, made by people who don't actively hate me. Yeah, there are still things out there like that. There are plenty of little independent projects you can find. Manga and anime are a blast. That's where I get most of my entertainment now. There's the occasional odd gem of a blockbuster that comes out and actually is worth watching because it's made by people who don't actively want to shame their fans. Seeing all of these small things gives me hope that one day the mainstream will be occupied by things run by people who actually love their fans. But for now, we'll just have to deal with the corpses of everything we once loved shambling around on the silver screen. Okay, whew. I think it's time to call it a wrap on that. Well, I hope you enjoyed my impassioned video essay rant that took me almost a month to make. And seriously, it took me up until attempt number 3 to come up with something that was like at least halfway coherent like this is. So yeah, it took up a colossal chunk of my free time to kind of work on this. So I'd really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe, because I'm going to be doing more review stuff that I've been doing on my channel. Maybe a few more videos like these where I really get into like the weeds on some topics and stuff. And I would also like it if you engaged with the video a little bit. I mean, if you like it, go ahead and tell me what you think about it. If you hate it, still go ahead. I enjoy the engagement either way, even though I will probably fight you. I seriously recommend considering hitting that subscribe button, because I'm going to be going over a lot of smaller independent things that I've picked up lately. Some things that might not be super mainstream, and I'll probably getting back to some of the anime and manga reviews I've done so far. Anyway, that's all out of me. Later.